Hi.
Hello, happy Thursday.
Oh, sorry. I've been watching a lot of blogs lately. What's going on, guys? Welcome to TFM Report.
No, that's not you.
No.
No.
Anyway, too many blogs lately. Yeah.
Blogs are okay.
YouTube videos, YouTube vloggers. Yeah.
But
Here's how you make a wood table out of epoxy and some nails. Awesome.
And you've got to remember to scream at the audience and swear. Put them down because that grabs everybody's attention. Because they all do that too. They all get mad.
Whoa. Sound doesn't go anywhere here. That's the Alex Jones approach. They're turning the frogs gay. So, yeah. Anyway, feeling pretty good because after getting on the show like 5 minutes late last time, scrambling at the last minute, I'm like, screw that. I've been working real hard since Monday to make sure that we don't do that again. So I've got an actual show list today. I'm prepared.
But not even that. Lots of calls to our internet provider to try and fix whatever is going on with our systems. So hopefully tonight will go better. We've got our backup plan with Michael Chuchong all set and ready to go. And it should be a great show.
Although I'm pretty confident in our speed tests. So we're good to go, I think, tonight.
Perfect. Mm-hmm. And tonight, it's part 3 of our secret societies. And we are doing the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yes. And as a TikToker once pointed out, we're very late to this table. We get that. We understand. We're still coming up with stuff that you haven't heard before. We completely changed our perspective on some stuff, which we'll share later. And we've got some stuff that nobody's ever seen before for tonight. And this is for people. There are still people in the world who don't know about Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations,
the
Bilderbergers, the Atlantic Council, and so on and so on and so on. The North American Treaty,
There's so many. And even us, as we're diving into one group, it leads us to another group, which leads us to another group, which leads us to another group. And as I said in the last show, I am seeing a pattern of all the same names crossing borders. That's what I see.
Yeah, and those dirty dogs in the Privy Council. We will end our show series with that. So we got stuff for you. Where do we want to start? Where it says introduction? You want to do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, the Council on Foreign Relations. This was officially started, I guess, in
1921.
Yes.
July.
Officially.
Yeah. Officially, they incorporated as a nonprofit in July of 1921.
Right.
But unofficially, they were meeting way back in 1917, 1918. Unofficially, just as a group of, guys sitting around in the back of a pub in New York City, talking politics.
Right. So this was kind of the smatterings, sort of official secret societies. We've all heard of the Illuminati and the Khazarian Mafia and Masons and all that. But in the late 1800s, they were fixing to take over the world at that point. That's when the Albert Pike letter came out, outlining this is how we do it. 3 world wars, and then we got it. And that came out in late 1890s in that area.
Yeah, well, another video I watched today said 1700s is when this all started. But things kept failing because they didn't quite have the communication and the strategy plan down right.
Well, that's when the Rothschilds kind of
took over.
Yeah, got into the banking scene. Like they standardized banking across the continent, and they also bamboozled the stock market of the time. And so that's when they really started coming into power. So maybe that's about when it started. Those dirty dog Satanists have been in the backgrounds for quite a long time. So, yeah. Dirty dog Satanists running the world, turning the frogs gay. So, spit take. So that brings us to this is the Council on Foreign Relations. This would be the seeds of globalism, but we're learning that globalism was kind of becoming a topic around the world, and people were starting to say, hey, we need to unite. There's too many skirmishes and wars and battles, and honestly that's just how they sold it. But the idea of international corporation, or not corporations but organizations, was really beginning to take hold.
Correct.
And so that leads us to, in order to be substituted, you know what, let's just make that solo so I can read it. If order was to be substituted for anarchy, means must be found whereby some questions, at least, could be discussed and decided on an international basis. Accordingly, a number of international organs were established and invested with varying powers of control over the individual national administrations. The first of these was the Danube Commission, set up by the Paris Conference in 1856. So that's about when midway through the 1800s.
They started getting their shit together.
Exactly. 9 years later, came the International Telegraphic Union. 9 years after that, the Universal Postal Union, the most powerful example of its kind. And for those of you who have been kind of diving into the deep for a few years at least now, would know that there's a lot more to the Postal Union than meets the eye. They have a lot more power than we all realize. By 1914, there were over 30 such bodies, of which the most important, besides those already mentioned, were the International Institute of Agriculture in Rome, 1905, and the International Health Office in Paris, 1907. So those were the seeds, the smatterings of modern day UN. They were already doing international
organizations in different countries.
Seed banks. They were starting to look at seed banks back then, and then an international health office. So they're already looking at making
DNA,
making health be the power key right there. Mention almost must be made of unofficial international societies, the Interparliamentary Union, so that's governments across the world, International Federation of Trade Unions, because we know how much power unions have, and countless bodies connected with religion, science, literature, sport, and indeed with almost every aspect of human existence. So that was pre-1900s, the smatterings of people saying, hey, we need globalism, and then they had to figure out how to sell it.
So there you go. We got seeds, we got health, we got media, we got sports, we've got politics, we've got trades. What else do we need?
Well, looks like we have the need for international foreign relations.
Exactly. So how did the International Foreign Relations, the Council, come about? Well, let's say it came about because of World War I.
Out of the ashes of a global conflict. Faced with the new horrors of total war, President Woodrow Wilson tasked 150 of the brightest minds with crafting a path to lasting peace. Known as the Inquiry, this project helps guide his vision for the post-war order.
That our people are wedded and devoted to the idea of international justice.
Members of the Inquiry set sail with President Wilson to work the sidelines of the Versailles Peace Conference. The treaty signed, European powers agree to Wilson's idea of a League of Nations.
The Inquiry.
So the Inquiry is busy unmuting our mic.
Oh, okay. So the Inquiry came about because after World War I, Woodrow Wilson saw an opportunity to have a gathering. There was a gathering that was going to be happening in Paris at the Majestic Hotel, and it was called the Paris Peace Meeting. Actually, Paris Peace, not meeting. I can't remember. Peace Assembly or Peace Treaty, I think it was. Anyway,
Fun jam.
Yeah. Woodrow Wilson decided to get 150 scholars, what he considered scholars, together. They wrote up over 2,000 reports to suggest how we could put an end to all world wars from ever happening again. And leading off those scholars, they came up with that's the wrong side. Those are the actual founders of the foreign relations, the council.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Wow. They were among the delegates that went to the Versailles as well, though, right?
No, only one of them was.
Which one?
It was Mr. I believe it was Mr. It was either Kravis or I can't read that.
So one of those
here.
guys
Anyway.
went to the and I know Herbert Hoover went. Oh no, he did not go. He was very opposed.
Yeah.
He was very opposed to that.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was Elijah Root. I believe it
Yes,
was Elijah
right.
Root that went with him, because Elijah Root at that point in time was the U.S. Secretary of War, I believe, at that time.
Right. So they came up with
So they came up with these 150 scholars out of 2,000 reports. This is them going over why the war happened, the mistakes that were made, and how we can stop future wars from happening. So out of those 2,000 reports, they slimmed it all the way down to just 14 points. And at the time, people don't know, is Lenin was in power with Russia, and he actually had a speech done up that was similar to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which is pretty amazing that, two very, very different leaders were sort of on the same page, but also not. So Woodrow Wilson went to the Paris meeting at the Majestic Hotel, which, by the way, was funded by Mr. Rockefeller himself.
Was it Rockefeller or Rothschild?
Oh, sorry, David. Yes. Rockefeller actually funds the Council of Foreign Relations.
Yeah, not to be missed. He's a chair. He's a chair on the Bilderbergers, and he's a chair over at Trilateral Commission as well. So
Yes.
I'm starting to think this guy's up to stuff.
You think?
Maybe.
So anyway, the 14 points, we've got slides for those.
We do.
So the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson presented was: one, there shall be no private international understandings. So that means part of why they're selling that World War I happened was because of all these treaties, these alliances that were made with all these countries, and they started seeing alliances and treaties happening that were starting to build a lot of power. And Germany started seeing all this power starting to unite around them and started getting a little bit freaked out and decided that they needed to start attacking before their country was gone or before power was gone.
Right.
So Woodrow Wilson's scholars from the inquiry decided, number one, there shall be no more private international understandings. Number two, the freedom of navigation upon the seas outside of territorial waters unless enforcement of international covenants, because the U.S. got involved because of a submarine coming into their waters. And that's what got them all freaked out. So they are saying nobody owns the waters. Everyone's allowed to navigate the seas unless it's right up on people's like beaches or right on their docks. They have to get permission to dock on the land. So that's what territorial waters means.
And all the pirates said, "Aw."
Number three, equality of trade conditions and removal of economic barriers. So it basically just meant everybody was going to start trading with everybody. Nobody was going to restrict trade, and it was going to trade on an even foot from now on and remove all economic barriers. So again, this is where the banks come in. Now you can borrow from the bank and everybody can trade equally. Whatever your country's missing, you can now buy from another country.
Oh, that sounds really great for the bank.
Right? Number four, national armaments will be reduced to lowest point consistent with domestic safety. So, right now we've got an arms race going on. So we know that number four didn't really last very long, but they were afraid that one country was going to end up with far more bombs and tanks and who knows what else. And that is an easy way to overtake somebody. Hence why, communist dictators tend to come and grab all your guns first, because those with the most guns wins. And if you're invited to a gunfight, you're not going to win if you come with a knife.
No, they come and take them by force or by buyback programs.
Exactly. Number five, impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, which means all the sovereign interests of the populations must have equal weight with equitable government. So basically, the British government went in, the colonial takeover of different lands, and they said, you know what? Let's kind of give them back their land, but we'll wait to see what the population is there, because if the population is mostly Brits, then Britain gets to keep that land, and et cetera, et cetera. Number 6, evacuation of all Russian territory and settlement of all questions affecting Russia and an opportunity for independent determination. So again, whatever territory Russia won or took over during the war, they now have to give it back. You may have won it, but you don't get to keep it. Thanks for coming out. However, again, if the territory was settled by the majority of Russian population, then they might actually be able to keep that, or at the very end of the day, that now becomes a new independent state or country, and they get to determine on their own whether they want to go back to the original state or stay with Russia. Number 7, Belgium be evacuated and restored and given the same sovereign rights as all other nations. So Belgium was demolished in World War One.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, okay, all you turkeys that took over Belgium, get out. Belgium gets to be itself again, and they get to have all the same sovereign rights as every other nation.
Right. And we were talking about Belgium, and it's still seeing the seeds of that, because it's a little bit German and a little bit France and a little bit its own culture now.
Yeah.
So it's still seeing the cultures that were torn apart and all of that. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Number 8, all French territory freed and invaded portions restored. So again, French get their land back and everybody's got to get out. Sorry. And we know Germany had a big part of the French territory. And even to this day, there's still several parts of France, that only speak German. Colmar, France is one of those. I know that because I went there. Number 9, readjustment of the frontiers of Italy. And I didn't realize that Italy was affected either, but yeah, so Italy got its land back, or its stake back as well.
They got the boot.
They got the boot. People of Austria-Hungary also be accorded autonomous development. So at that time, Austria and Hungary were one in the same country, so they were allowed to do what they wanted to do. Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, they needed to be evacuated and occupied territories restored. And as a Balkan state allegiance treaty, they were allowed to actually have a treaty or an agreement put into place, because the three of them are kind of sit in the middle of all these other countries, and they have no water access.
Oh, the Balkans are always like point of contention in world wars. They're always like strategically there, important. So they get smacked all the time.
Exactly. So they were allowed to have their own alliance. They were allowed to, and that alliance regarded political, economical, and safe usage of and access to the sea, the Balkan Sea. And then number 12, the Turkish portion of the Ottoman Empire. And this one's really interesting when I read about it. The Turkish portion of the Ottoman Empire are given secured sovereignty, and other nationalities are also given secured absolute autonomous development, and the Dardanelles opened for free passage of ships. Now, this is really important because the Ottoman Empire was massacring everywhere, massacring many Turkish cities. But not only that, there was a genocide of Armenia going on. And the scholars, the inquiry scholars under Woodrow Wilson, actually told Woodrow Wilson to specifically mention Armenia be given back to the Armenians, and that the Ottoman Empire had to vacate. And not really sure why Woodrow Wilson didn't want to actually specifically name them. So he just thought putting it as other nationalities are also given secured absolute autonomous development covered the Armenians. And as we know today, they are still being absolutely demolished and destroyed by the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So this one we know didn't really work out either.
Nope.
And 13, an independent Polish state should be erected and should include the Polish populated territories and given free access to the state. So I guess at that time was it the Soviet Union at that time? So they were saying, you know what, there's such a massive Polish population, they should really have their own nation, their own state. So let's give it to them. And all those territories that are actually highly populated by the Polish, let's make that, which we know as Poland. And again, access to the sea was huge because you can't really trade with other countries if you don't have access to the sea.
Exactly right. Yeah. So, and then finally the punchline.
The punchline number 14. You want to do the honors?
Sure, a general association of nations should be established to guarantee a political independence and territorial integrity. So that was the first proposal of the League of Nations.
There you go. Back there, Woodrow Wilson gets the clap, the honor of starting the League of Nations.
Yeah, exactly right, Hashem. It's still being affected today. So they didn't really go anywhere.
No.
So,
and from that meeting, we got the Treaty of Versailles.
right, the Treaty of Versailles, and then Woodrow Wilson, as they said in the first video, him and his delegates went there to go work the room and raise support for a League of Nations. And here's Herbert Hoover, who was a later president, served under Woodrow Wilson, so he was there. He was in the room when it happened.
And from the beginning, Woodrow Wilson looked beyond the winning of the war. His consuming purpose was to make sure that the world would have a lasting peace. In January 1918, 9 months after the declaration of war, the President, in an eloquent address to the Congress, laid down his 14 points which must dominate the making of the peace. In subsequent addresses, he added further principles and actions until they amounted to 35 points in all. Therein, Woodrow Wilson proposed a new order and a new era in world affairs. A few days after the armistice, President Wilson let it be known that he proposed to go to Paris as the head of the American peace delegation. Many of his associates, including myself, advised him not to go. We argued that he would be involved in secret committee meetings where the most powerful voice in the world, would be stilled. We believed that from the White House, it could be thunder and lightning to the whole world. But that in Paris, he would be trapped in intrigue and in greed. The Germans sent a small delegation back to Paris to sign. On June 28, 1919, these new German representatives and all of the 27 Allied delegations convened in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles to witness the signing of the treaty. And many of our American colleagues witnessed the glittering ceremonies with sinking hearts for the future of the world. All of the Allied statesmen, except Clemenceau, left Paris. The gates of Versailles swung closed. The weary and ailing president came home. In Washington, Wilson found voices like these sounding in the Senate. Senator Borah of Idaho said, "It took George Washington 7 years to gain independence from George III. And now, my friends, they want to give it back to George V. And Senator Hiram Johnson added, "He is asking us to hand American destiny over to the secret councils of Europe." It is the duty of senators of this nation to keep America American. A few Democratic senators said it was the end of American independence.
I love the second guy with the fists. So there's quite an opposition. So basically, he had come up with this idea of a League of Nations, and this was highlighted in a way to say, if we work internationally, we reduce wars. And there was a massive support for the idea of not going back to the horror of war, because they're just coming out of World War I. Everybody's seen how bad it can get. And what was not noticed during the First World War is that was when they created the Federal Reserve.
Right.
So the bankers were getting their foothold in. And that was when the introduction of the federal income tax in Canada began. And that was when they finally got support for the idea of the League of Nations.
Correct.
So he mentioned two senators there that were opposed. One of those senators, the first one, Bora, the guy without the fists up, just the awesome promo shot, said, "I will fight for you." He actually delivered a speech at the Council of Foreign Relations, and I don't know how he got in there because he's adamantly opposed to what they were doing. So during his speech, it was like a 6-page piece, and it was really good, but it's so pertinent for today. This is a small snippet. It is one of the crowning glories of the world that we have different peoples and different nations and different civilizations and different political concepts. Standardization might be all right for cattle and sheep and swine of all kinds, but is not acceptable to peoples or nations and is not in accordance with the divine economy of things. Another revolution, therefore, has failed. It had to fail. Now, again, this was coming off the heels of Senate voting down Wilson's proposal for getting into the League of Nations, and the Senate did not support it at that time. So another revolution, therefore, had failed. It had to fail. It could not escape the living past. It did not weigh sufficiently the inertia of human nature. It underestimated the strength of those ancient prejudices and fears, as well as those ancient faiths and beliefs. The intellectual and moral paths over which men and women had trodden for centuries. The fight against nationalism has lost. It was bound to lose. It was a fight against the strongest and noblest passion outside of those which spring from man's relation to his God, that moves or controls the impulses of the human heart. Without it, civilization would wane and utterly decay. Men would sink into the level of savages. Individuality in persons is the product of the most persistent and universal law of nature. It is woven of millions of subtle and tireless forces. No power can change this law or frustrate its operation. This is equally true of nations. Internationalism, if it means anything more than the friendly cooperation between separate, distinct, and wholly independent nations, rests upon a false foundation. And when undertaken, it will fail as in the name of progress in humanity, it should fail. Nationalism, pride, and love of country is a passion peculiar to no people, indispensable to the welfare of all. To undertake its destruction is madness.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I'm not sure where he stands on that.
So the first attempt at globalization failed because guess what? The gentleman who was sent over to the United States to infiltrate the government, he succeeded on all of his attempts, but however, he forgot the one part of the agenda, which was not just infiltrate the healthcare and get the banks going and infiltrate the government, but he forgot about media propaganda. And because the US citizens, war was over, things were happy, livelihood started again, and, you know, we had the roaring 20s and all of that sort of stuff. They didn't buy that we needed a global think tank to look after everything. So this is why originally the League of Nations, now known as the United Nations, failed because the US did not sign into it.
However, the Brits were way ahead at that time. The Brits were way in front of it. So the British Institute of International Affairs began. So they beat out the States.
Oh, but wait a minute. Before we got to the British Institute of International Affairs, the Brits and the Americans who were part of the agenda went, whoa, shoot, how did we miss this part of it? You know what? We're going to get together and we're going to start talking to each other and be each other's think tanks and figure out how we can bring around the people into the League of Nations again. So they actually formed the Institute of International Affairs, which had offices in London and New York. However, what happened was the British went home and went, we're not going to let the Americans get one over on us. So they came up with the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as the Chatham House. See where we get the Chatham House rules from? British Institute of International Affairs.
Exactly. So if you believe the official statement, Council of Foreign Relations went off and formed their own, it was sort of birthed out of that. British Institute of International Affairs was birthed out of that, became Chatham House. And the Canadian Institute of International Affairs later became the Canadian International Council, and they formed with two other departments to become the Canadian International Council. And together, they started working towards the League of Nations.
Correct. And the Americans found out that they were being left out of information with the Institute of International Affairs when they found out that the British had done the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They felt that they were being isolated out of decision making. And they heard about these groups of corporate men meeting in New York City under the guise of the Council of Foreign Relations. So they joined them in secret meetings. And then July 1921, they realized for tax purposes, they could get out of paying tax if they actually incorporated as a nonprofit. That was the loophole. The government put in legislation, rubber stamping that if you're a nonprofit corporation, you don't pay taxes. Voila. And guess what? Canadian government followed suit for their Institute of Foreign Relations as well. So all these rich folks figured out a way not to have to pay tax, while the middlemen and those below the middlemen got stuck with all the tax.
Right. Now, just a side note, back to modern day for a second, Council of Foreign Relations. If you've been following along with our series, here's something interesting. Look who is one of the presidents of Chatham House in England.
Mr.
Mark Carney shows his face again. So we'll be revisiting Mark Carney again later. So, so they were still trying to make it happen. They had gone to the Treaty of Versailles, and that's when they were trying to make it work before it got voted down. And here's the delegation in action.
The Council's first high-profile event brings the former French Prime Minister to tour the country and to speak. But for the most part, early members focused on behind-the-scenes influence. The Council also launched a quarterly publication titled Foreign Affairs to produce analysis on important global issues. It quickly became the most influential journal on international relations in America, and soon the world, making its way to the desks of leaders like Vladimir Lenin. A young writer named Hamilton Fish Armstrong is recruited to edit Foreign Affairs for nearly 50 years. He seeks out contributions from academics and statesmen around the globe, driving vigorous debates during turbulent times.
So the founders of the CFR, which it became known, which was financially supported by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and then later on, the Carnegie Corporation also started funding it. And more than half of government officials from 1945 to 1972 are actually members of the CFR. Mm-hmm. So when the CFR says, oh, our mandate isn't to make policy or encourage policy, they're actually lying, flat out lying, when over half their members are actually part of the government.
Well, they contradict themselves. I mean, this is our last slide, but we can play it now. They contradict themselves. Okay. The CFR is an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, and publisher dedicated to being a resource for its members, government officials, business executives, journalists, educators, and students, civic and religious leaders, and other interested citizens in order to help them better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. CFR carries out this mission by maintaining a diverse membership and then convening meetings where senior government officials, members of Congress, global leaders, and prominent thinkers come together to discuss and debate major international issues, but no policies are ever made. Supporting a studies program that fosters independent research, enabling CFR scholars to produce articles, reports, and books, and hold roundtables that analyze foreign policy issues and make concrete policy recommendations. They contradict themselves in their own mission statement.
Yes.
Publishing Foreign Affairs, the preeminent journal of international affairs and U.S. foreign policy, and then sponsoring independent task forces that produce reports that get reported on its own website. So,
who were the founders of the CFR?
Well, is that those guys that we brought up before?
Those are those guys.
These guys?
That's those guys. Those guys. So we have Eli Root, who was a Republican politician, believe it or not, and then flipped over to all of these guys started out as one and then flipped over to the other. So both the CFR is filled to the gills with both Republican and Democrats. So it's not one or the other. It's actually a uniparty, much like here in Canada. Conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP, they all play on the same field, on the same team. They just, for shits and giggles, give themselves all different team names to look like they're actually competing. That way they cover their bases with all areas of civilization.
Makes for good theater, though, like yesterday.
Yeah, right. So Eli Root, he was also a U.S. attorney for the South District of New York. He was a U.S. Secretary of War under President William McKinley and President Theodore Roosevelt. He was a U.S. Secretary of State under Roosevelt. He was a U.S. Senator. He was also a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1912. His main form of income, other than all this secret income, he was a lawyer out of New York City. He also headed up the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was part of the American Society of International Law. He established the U.S. Army War College. He maintained an open door policy with China. Surprise, surprise. He was a permanent member of the Court of International Justice. And this is interesting. He was also a member of Sigma Phi Society and Phi Beta Kappa Society. He went to the Clinton Grammar School and the Hamilton College and New York School of Law. Now, here's the big one. His main clients as a lawyer are the Bank of North America, which is now the Bank of America, Jay Gould, Tammy Hall, William H. Tweed, Chester and Arthur Charles, Charles Anderson Dana, William Whitney, Thomas Fortune Ryan, the Havemeyer family, E.H. Harriman. He was elected to the North American Trust Company, which is an insurance company. He is an advisor to the U.S. House Representative Thomas Brackett Reed. He was also an executive member of the Union League Club. And he was the VP, Chester A. Arthur was the VP of the USA. And he was an advisor to him, and he was an advisor to Theodore Roosevelt as well. So, you know, for a guy that has no influence on social policy, he seems to have a lot of influence, period.
Right. You know, and when we're going through these pictures, it's funny because we see Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, there he is introducing Bush in one picture. There he is standing with Clinton in another picture. There he is standing with Carter in another picture. He's behind the scenes where Reagan was. Rockefeller's everywhere. So
Correct.
these guys say they don't influence anything, but at the same time, they're everywhere behind the scenes. Everywhere you look,
Exactly.
they're back in the picture.
As George Carlin says, it's a big club and we're not in it.
You're not in it.
I'm not in it. John W. Davis, he was another founding member. There was 4 founding members. He was the Solicitor General of the U.S. He was the U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom under Woodrow Wilson. His father was John James Davis, and he was a delegate to the Wheeling Convention and was also part of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's a lawyer. He was called to the bar. Guess who his clients were?
Toys R Us.
Might as well be. J.P. Morgan.
Well, he obviously successful.
Right. And the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, which again was another big giant company that was embroiled in a giant lawsuit with the government. He was trying to take the government down for, fraud and money laundering. He also, one of his major clients as well for the entire life of his lifetime was also the railroads.
Oh, lots of money in the railroads.
Lots of money there. His daughter Julie married Charles P. Healy. Have we not heard his name in the Bilderbergers? Was it Bilderbergers that we just did? And Charles P. Healy was part of that. She also married William she ended up divorcing Charles and ended up marrying William Adams. And William Adams was the son of the president of U.S. Rebar Company. And Julia also was a journalist at the Associated Press. They were not going to miss the media propaganda this time. And his adopted son, Cyrus Vance, he served as Secretary of State under Jimmy Carter. No influence there, none whatsoever.
Yeah, these guys span careers that influence many, many presidents. It's
Right.
amazing.
He was also elected to West Virginia's House of Delegates, so he was a U.S. House Representative. He was a Republican and then flipped over to being a Democrat, so he worked both sides of the street as well. He was a member of the National Advisory Council of the Crusaders. He was chairman of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. He formed the American Liberty League. He was an open supporter of Algier Heath and J. Robert Oppenheimer during the McCarthy trials. And he was also a member of the Freemasons and, look at this, Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Beta Kappa Psi.
Oh, dirty frat brothers.
Right? John Davis. And then we go on to Paul Drennan Cravath. I think I'm saying his last name right. I might not be. Cravath. He was a leader in the Atlanticist movement. He devised and implemented the Cravath system, which defines the structure and practice of most large law firms. And that even stands true to today. Most large law firms operate under his structure that he implemented. Interesting. He's a descendant of president of Fisk University. He went to a boarding school in Geneva. He graduated from Oberlin College, also attended Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute and also Columbia Law School. He worked as a salesman for Globe Oil Company, which is a subsidiary of Standard Oil. He later on ended up having a law partnership with William Hornblower and Walter S. Carter and Charles Evans Hughes. And one of their biggest clients was Westinghouse. And Westinghouse was embroiled that whole time in a lawsuit regarding patents with Thomas Edison. So they were taking over the energy sector.
Edison was in so many lawsuits.
Right.
He stole a lot too.
His partner as well, William Dameron Guthrie, was the lawyer for the Rockefeller family.
Right.
Maybe that's why the Rockefellers and all of them were funding them. Maybe. He was also a Knight of the Legion of Honor by the French government. He was a member and chairman of the Fisk University and Board of Trustees. He was a director of the New York Symphony Society, Juilliard School of Music, and the Metropolitan Opera. So they not only covered now the media and politics, but they've now covered the arts. You see where this is going? In order to be successful the second time around, they were leaving nothing to chance. They were covering their bases and getting their little dirty hands into every part of society. And then the last gentleman, Edwin Francis Gay. He was an American economist and professor of economic history. He was the dean of Harvard Business School.
That's where Skull and Bones was born.
Right. And guess where else he went to school? Switzerland. So we've got two guys that went to school in Geneva, Switzerland. He graduated from the University of Michigan. He also studied at 4 other universities: Leipzig, Gothenburg, Zurich, Berlin, and London. 5 other universities. He has a PhD from the University of Berlin under the supervision of Gustav von Schmoller. And when I looked into why was that so important that got mentioned in his bio, Gustav von Schmoller is an economist and socialist reformer pushing economic and social policy. He's quoted as saying, "Describe a hierarchical order of races," when he presented on when he presented as a basis of economics. Most of his books were written in German because German was considered the dominant scholarly language at the time, and none of his books were translated into English. So I wonder what his books say if he believed in racism and that races had a contribution to the basis of economics. And if you look at the majority of these secret societies, economics keeps them up, but they also have something else in common. I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that is either. What was that?
Color of my skin.
Oh, I see. Whitey tighties.
Whitey tighties.
Okay.
He was Edwin Gray was the chair of the Planning and Statistics Division of War Industries Board during World War I. Do you think maybe that's why some of our World War I information is a little bit skewed? He was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science. He was elected as a fellow of the American Statistical Association. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society. He was a representative and de facto chair of the International Scientific Commission on Price History. He was president of the New York Evening Post, and he was a director of the Shipping Board. So now they've covered off transportation and shipping, the ports. To covering off the agenda.
Right. And so they got their bases covered. They've got Council of Foreign Relations birthed. They're working towards that, getting that League of Nations. The League of Nations is growing in strength, but they can't quite sell it. They still can't quite get people on board.
Exactly.
And the U.S. is still going, we don't need a League of Nations. We don't need to be part of the world stage. We need to get along with other countries. We're doing just fine. So they needed a way to sell it, just like they needed a way to sell the League of Nations. However, were they going to sell the United Nations?
We are now in this war. We're all in it.
With the United States at war again and the State Department lacking a policy planning capability, the Council steps into the breach. Over the next 5 years, Council members produced nearly 700 memoranda, a roadmap for a post-war world order underpinned by American-led international organizations.
A great victory has been won. The entire world lies quietly at peace.
A new world order. So they used Second World War. And how did they get the states into a war
That they didn't want to be in?
that they didn't want to be in? Do you remember how?
Wasn't that the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
It was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which was shady at best. So many people reported that early warning systems didn't go off. They were told to stand down because they needed the states to get into the war. And once that happened, then the states had to, it's basically propping their eyes open and making them look at the horrors of war. So they could, well, what did they do? In Second World War, they introduced the United Nations. The introduction was United Nations was in 1945, right on the heels of the Great War, Second Great War.
Exactly.
So we're starting to look at this in a whole new light, of course. There's a whole bunch of stuff going around talking about everybody's history has been rewritten and Hitler wasn't who you thought he was. And that the nationalism portion of that was they were the National Socialists, so they were evil, and it's the nationalism that gave rise to the Nazis. So where you've got this other guy right in the beginning, the Bora, he's like, nationalism is the only thing that's going to save us and keep us,
out of war and out of
keep us in
globalism.
civility, right? So they needed a Second World War to introduce more globalism, to introduce the United Nations. And we have gone, people just scratch the surface on the United Nations. They have organizations within the United Nations that cover off every single thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And not only that, the Council for Foreign Relations started, as we saw earlier, they started a publication, a bi-monthly publication, and that is still being published even today.
Right.
Behind the scenes, those publications actually go to the CIA, and the CIA is the one that helps with government policy. So it looks like they're not giving policy, but then they're the advisors again of every president, every government. They are solidly entrenched. Over 50% of their members are solidly entrenched in government because they have no rules about that, unlike the Trilateral Commission. But also, they run a think tank behind the scenes, and it was originally called, I had it right in front of me just a second ago, but it is now known as the David Rockefeller School of or
Satanism,
not Satanism,
indoctrination.
David Rockefeller Studies Program. There it is. And that studies
601.
program has 70 full-time and part-time, plus visiting scholars and practitioners, which are called fellows. And they're made up of academia, government, media, and the private sector. And they study nuclear proliferation, terrorism, energy, trade, global governance, international economics and finance, climate change, development, global health, defense policy, cyber, and digital policy. And then they write about it in their bi-monthly manual, which then goes to the CIA, which then goes up the chain. And voila, you've got now government legislation born and government policy born. And
we talked about this. We've talked about this in carbon colonization. We've talked about this in the last 3 shows. We've talked about how they create these baselines and these studies, and then those studies are available to make policy. So even though they say they're not making policy, they're making the foundation for other people to make the policy.
Exactly. And that's all from their published book, published magazine called Foreign Affairs. And it is sponsored by the David Rockefeller Association.
Right.
Ba-ba-ba-ba.
So we've dug into the FBI files, unclassified, and they've been released FBI files. And there's a lot in there, one of which is the FBI continually renewing their subscription to Foreign Affairs. Now, everybody got Foreign Affairs, so did the FBI, so they know full well what the Council of Foreign Relations was. And the other half of those files were people writing into the FBI saying, what is the Council of Foreign Relations? I'm getting a little concerned that we've got this shadow government. And they would always get the letter back, form letter from Hoover saying, well, we don't investigate them. We've never investigated them. So we really don't know what it is, what you're talking about. And that's all they responded with. And if we had any files, you'd have to ask the Department of Justice for that, even though they're getting their newsletters like twice
every 2 months.
Is it every 2 months? Okay.
Yeah, every 2 months the books are published.
Not only that, the Council on Foreign Relations directly writes to them. And basically they say, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Just wanted to point out that Alan Dulles was the president of the Council of Foreign Relations. He helped edit the Foreign Affairs for years and years and years, and he became the very first civilian director of the CIA. So here, this is the Council of Foreign Relations in a confidential letter to the FBI, basically saying it's very hard to make out there, but they're saying that the Russian Soviet Union United Nations delegation is located directly across the street from them. And our organization, the above organization, which is us, is a highly confidential and organization that have held very confidential conferences. So they're straight up saying to the FBI, we're doing very confidential things here.
But it says confidential conferences with such men as General Montgomery, General Eisenhower, and Mr. Schuman of France. So they don't want a communist office across the road. So do something about it.
Right.
But again, they have no effect on policy.
Right. Their official statement is that they do not know what's going on in the Council of Foreign Relations. So the Council of Foreign Relations themselves back then say we're a secret organization, we're not really policymakers, we're open and inclusive internationally, yet they're doing highly confidential things within those walls. And in their own mission statement, they're saying we don't set policy, but we set the things where they set the policy from, basically.
Yeah. And did you know that they have published over 450 books?
No, I did not know that.
But again,
Name them, all of them.
no influence over any sort of policy that our government makes.
No, Foreign Affairs is the most read foreign policy book out there, and has been since its inception decades and decades ago. But they have no influence whatsoever. So we found a bunch of speakers over the years who've been part of them, who, they are supportive, to say the least, of the Council on Foreign Relations. And again, just like we said with Bilderberg, we all talk about this like it's just open, like an open book, but they denied that the even existence of the Council of Foreign Relations for many, many years. It was there. People knew they published the newsletter, but other than that, it's what happened within those walls were highly secretive. They're a little more open now, but over the years, here's some of the speakers that they've had on their stages: Herbert Hoover, Robert Oppenheimer, creator of the atomic bomb, Dwight D. Eisenhower. If there's a president, of course presidents are going to be, but the Shah of Iran, Harry Truman, Fidel Castro, Indira Gandhi, King Faisal, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, Henry Kissinger, who's also involved in Trilateral, who was also involved in Bilderberg, Dalai Lama, and the George H.W. Bush, the dad, and introduced him was Rockefeller, Daniel Ortega, Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, Boris Yeltsin, Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, Madeleine Albright, Yasser Arafat, Kofi Annan, who was the former Secretary General of the UN, Bill Clinton, Hugo Chavez, George Bush Jr., Barack Obama, Condoleezza Rice, Muammar Gaddafi. And I would have loved to see that speech,
right?
Because his UN speech is just it's
incredible.
He's like the sand-covered Trump. Hillary Clinton, Narendra Modi, and then of course Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland took the stage, and they gave long speeches about how our elections are not rigged. That was
by
a
Russia.
big portion of it.
No, our elections are not rigged by Russia, but they didn't mention China.
Right. Now, another video we found of somebody who spoke on their stage.
Obama, that one?
No.
Oh, okay. Which one are we talking?
Jordan Peterson.
Oh, no, that was the Trilateral Commission.
Was it?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was these guys.
No, it's the Trilateral Commission.
Because we just found that video.
Yes,
we found that video. We should have mentioned that because we found it after the last show.
No, but you put his picture up on the last show. Yes.
See, they're all running together now. There we go. That last show was such a schmozzle that I don't remember anything.
Yeah, but all of these names cross boundaries. They're all involved. And right. I bet you if we and you have to know that their membership list, not everybody is published on it. We know the Brothmans are included, and yet we can't find their names anywhere.
Right. Canadian Rothschilds.
Yeah, many Rothschilds. We know the CIA director, who is it? Or sorry, the Pentagon. Sorry, we mentioned his name last week, or last show. Sorry, the Pentagon, the director of the Pentagon. He's been at these meetings, but you can't find his name anywhere.
Maureen O'Sullivan.
Yeah.
Is it Maureen?
Megan
O'Sullivan, who is the chair of the Trilateral Commission, is also in the board members of this. So
and. Oh my gosh, George Clooney is a member of this. I'm like, shock. What? George? No.
Yeah,
no,
of course.
Not George.
Him and his wife. So there's a partial list. And we've already gone over the mission statement. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the Council of Foreign Relations.
So they are another secret society that they all say doesn't exist, that they, again, meet in secrecy. They follow the Chatham House rules. They have a publication called Foreign Affairs that is published twice or every 2 months. The CIA, FBI gets a copy. Over 50% of their members are in the government, current running government, and have been through since 1945 to till present anyway. And that list of membership just keeps growing.
Right. So where this pertains to today is, Albert Pike wrote, we brought him up at the beginning of the show. He wrote a letter in 1899, I believe, 1898. And that outlined, here's how we take over the world. We're going to do it through a set of 3 world wars, and those world wars have happened. I read this letter back in the 80s. Snopes is trying to debunk it now and say it's not real, but it already called out what's happening today back, and I read it like years ago. And so they're trying to say that it's not real, but I don't know. It was pretty predictive of what was going on 40, 50 years ago. I could barely read. I was so young in the 80s. I was like 5 years old in the 80s.
You were not. But at the end of the day, the original agenda it started out with just get the banks in, make as much money as we can, and those who oppose the Federal Reserve banks. And we all know that when the banks print money, they print it because the government wants it, needs it. They sell bonds and treasury bills or they trade those to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints off a bunch of money, gives it to the government. However, the government trades or allows them to hold these treasury bills as collateral. So the moment that bill is printed, interest is charged on it.
Yep.
And lo and behold, that's how these secret societies have so much money. They don't know what to do with it. It's fallen out of every orifice they own, and they're bored. And once they finally established their reserve banks everywhere, they went, now what? We've accomplished this. Wait a minute. Let's control the world. Let's do the one world order. And so that's been their plan, continuous plan, and why they have made every stride they can to now own all the choke points of society, plus get their little dirty hands onto every part of leadership and in the media, because they learned over the years that you needed to have the media in their pocket to to throw out propaganda at us. They also needed all the schools in their pocket so that they could start indoctrinating people early. And part of what they've learned over the years is if you don't have division, you can't create conflict and chaos. Therefore, they don't make more money or have the control that they would like. So they create chaos everywhere they can. And if you start researching nonprofit organizations and a lot of these charity organizations, such as Black Lives Matter, such as the LGBTQ charities and nonprofit organizations, you will see that a lot of these organizations that cause a lot of division are actually funded by these players in these secret societies.
Right. So that brings us to today. I saw a video where they've been declaring 2023 as the first year of the New World Order. How are they going to bring that about? How are they going to sell people on the idea of a global unified government? We have to look back at the horrors of war. We've learned from World War I. We've learned from World War II tonight. So they're obviously going to want to set the tone for another global war, which we're seeing now in order for the world to be ready for a one world government, which they are ready to go forward in. And so they have to sell us on that, and they have to use the horrors of war to do that again. And we don't want to fearmonger, but I mean, it's pretty obvious to us now that they're using wars to bring their globalist agenda about.
But as long as we keep saying no, they keep losing. Russia, by the way, continues to say no, which pisses them off, but it also scares them because Russia is a major superpower and they have no access to Russia. So lo and behold, what's going on now? Where's the conflict? Russia.
Right. NATO is going to intrude upon their borders, and they are threatening to go fairly brutal with that. They've alluded to nuclear war, and our globalist maniac government is still going forward with this war in Ukraine and just pushing their kids into the grinders. We saw a video where this lady was talking about her brother, his passport expired, and he has to go back to Ukraine now in order to renew his passport. He can't do it from the embassy where he's at.
They won't do it.
They're going to conscript him when he gets back there. And so this is what it's come to. And our government is still pushing forward with that like maniacs. They are. I mean, our prime minister. I'm going to coin the phrase now. I just made this up. Our prime minister is a wacko. I just made that up now. Yeah.
Our wacko prime minister's policies.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's the show on Trilateral. We're going to
No, Council of Foreign
that
Relations.
thing. Yeah. It's just, we've been doing so much research that it's all
all running
interconnected.
together
And
now.
yeah, I get them all mixed up. So we're going to bring it all home now. We're going to do the granddaddy, how do they all fit together? And we will finish with that. And then a little icing on the top. We'll bring it back with a bit of a Canadian flavor to it as well. That is our final show in the series. That's Monday. And then we'll have a pre-recorded show for you next Thursday, because we are going to go. We got invited to, remember Vanessa Dillon, who was on our show, COVID Collateral filmmaker. We get to go see the premiere on next Thursday night in Toronto. So we're really looking forward to that. So
Yeah. So if you've seen an advertisement for COVID Collateral, get your tickets. There's going to be some amazing Q&A panel afterwards.
I will try to show you how to put the events page together, and then we will put that up, and we'll try and put links to where you can get tickets on that on our events page.
Exactly. But
We've been
Rodney
terrible
Palmer,
at filling that in.
Rodney Palmer is going to be the MC of that event. And, there's some very prominent speakers, and you'll get to meet Vanessa Dillon because she will be there. We've seen the trailers. We played the trailer on our show. It looks like another really great documentary.
Some great speakers afterwards, and a little bit of mix and mingle ahead of time. So yeah, it proves to be a good night.
Exactly.
So-
And then we have the Sustainable Ownership Sovereignty. I guess you want to call it an information session that is happening on Sunday, May 5th. You can go to www.offgridfreedom.ca to get information on that. So if you are looking at owning a piece of sovereign, unorganized township land, you might want to come to this and learn how to live off grid and sustain yourself. There'll be a backyard barbecue and homesteading experts and speakers to ask all kinds of questions and find out a little bit about sustainable ownership sovereignty.
And we will be there. So if we don't see you there, we will see you on Monday, and we will leave you with this. Good night, everybody.